right, welcome to the Janus Project. You can see I'm wearing a slightly different color blanket this week. It's still cold in here, and so I'm going to stop the video periodically and hopefully be able to catch up with my heat. I came in here earlier to set up the heat, and it turned out my heater wasn't working, so yay! During parts of the year, it is really easy to record in here because it's, for like 2 days of the year, it's a good temperature. All the rest of the time, it's either way too hot, so I have to stop in the middle of filming to turn the fan on, or it gets way too cold, and so there's this. So got a lot of new stuff coming out on the channel this week. Those of you who've been paying attention, you might have noticed I started posting some other sermons, and so I just last week I posted a devotional I did for a father-son camp, and so it was a thing on fatherhood. And then I posted another video just kind of reviewing some other videos on Jesus being a socialist. I'm fairly active on Twitter, and so be sure to follow me there to see some of the goings-on I have and some of the interaction I have with various people. Been having some really good interactions with some folks. I'm going to talk about that in the video today. But I've been interacting with some folks on Twitter and just kind of seeing I'm just going to call it the woke crowd and what they say about Jesus, and it's so very wrong. And so I want to cover a little bit of that today. Lord willing, over the next week or so, we're going to do the doctrine of Christmas. I hope to have a video on the doctrine of why people suffer come out soon. And then I have a few book reviews I want to do leading into the Christmas season. So got a lot of stuff planned. We'll see how much of it I can get done. And so there may be a few videos that come out during the Christmas week. But keep an eye. I've got about 6 more videos in the queue for the Ecclesiastes class that I've been teaching, and so if you're interested at all, I'd suggest looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. It's going to be a really good read for you, and I hope the class does a good job of explaining it. But I'm going to ask you to check that out. It's about right now it's been about 9 or so lessons. I didn't record one of them, so that's why you'll see it referenced in the audio, but I don't have a recording of it. So a lot of that gets reviewed throughout the class, and so technically the one I uploaded is lesson 2. If you want a copy of the notes, I can get those to you. Just give me some way to get in touch with you, and I can send you the notes that I reference in the class. But anyway, so that's what's coming up. Like I said, we got some book reviews. We've got some doctrine of Christmas, and today we're going to be doing the doctrine of Christ. Now, in Christian theology, Jesus is the most important character. I hesitate even to say it like that because he's more than just a character. But you understand what I mean. If the Bible were a narrative, if it was a story, Jesus was like that character that was foreshadowed the whole time, and he's the focus of the whole book. And so I want to make sure we explain things from a Christian perspective. And I'm going to cover about 3 different memes that I've seen, or at least 3 different random expressions that you see people use. And I'll kind of put them up here in the sidebar so you can read what I'm talking about. The first one has to do with Jesus' birth. Now, with Jesus' birth, we don't know exactly what date it is. We'll get into some of that when I talk about the doctrine of Christmas. And I'm going to put it in quotes. But the doctrine of Christmas. But Jesus' birth is celebrated on Christmas Day or about 12 days later, so beginning of January, depending on what faith tradition you come from. Now, as we talk about Jesus, some people have tried to co-opt Jesus to basically say whatever they want him to say. So here's one quote, and again, I'll throw it up on the sidebar so you can read it. It says, "Christmas is about believing what a woman said about her sex life. Christmas is about a family finding safety as refugees. Christmas is about a child in need receiving support from the wealthy. Christmas is about God identifying with the marginalized, not the powerful." Now, I don't have a big problem with a lot of those statements individually. I don't know what they're trying to suggest with Christmas is about believing what a woman said about her sex life. The closest the Bible gets to being concerned about someone's sex life is, are you committing adultery? Are you a person who is lustful? That's where the Bible goes. It's funny because there's a passage in the scripture where a woman is caught in the act of adultery, and it's very clear she's guilty. I mean, she was caught in the very act, and so the Pharisees and stuff bring her before Jesus, and Jesus says, "Okay." He sits down, he writes some stuff in the dirt. Nobody really knows what he wrote, and then he stands up and he says, "All right, you who are without sin, you cast the first stone." And all of the Pharisees walk away. And so Jesus looks at her and says, all right, where are the men who accused you? And she says, they're not here. And he goes, okay, go and sin no more. So he acknowledged that what she had done was a sin, which, let's just say, the left is never going to acknowledge, like, any sex act is a sin. I mean, it's you do you. I mean, that's basically their mantra. And so to not belabor this point anymore, Jesus is concerned about sexual purity, but to say, Christmas is about believing what a woman said about her sex life, that's just stupid. That's not a thing. Christmas is about a family finding safety as refugees. You know what? We should take care of the poor and the needy and the refugee and all of that stuff. But what they're doing is they're using this as a hammer to beat pretty much America into saying you should accept all refugees no matter what. A nation has the right to say who can come in and who can't. That's kind of standard for what every nation does. And if you don't like that, you should look at the rules Mexico and China and other countries have for people who are allowed to come and stay in their country. So I realize that we hold the United States to a higher standard because we're the best. But this whole idea of we are going to use the Bible story as an excuse for open borders. No, that's not how it is. Even if you look at the way Jesus talks in the Bible, I use Jesus. Jesus is God, and so there's times where God is talking, and I say Jesus. So if you look at how God talks in the Bible, there were requirements on the alien that was dwelling with you. So that would be a refugee. That would be someone who was not of your nation. There were requirements on them. And so I would say, sure, if we're going to let a refugee come in, I think we should be okay with having some requirements on them. But for some reason, that's just foreboding. Okay, whatever. Christmas is about a child in need receiving support from the wealthy. Again, all of this is basically leftist propaganda. That is what they're doing. They're trying to say that, socialism is good and you should take care of the poor. Because they've worded it like this. Because they've worded it in this way that says it is about a child in need. Yeah, I guess Jesus was sort of a child in need, but Joseph, he owned apparently some sort of carpenter business, or at least he did shortly after they came back. They were in Bethlehem not because they were moving there or anything like that. They were in Bethlehem because they had to be there for the census. That was it. Like it wasn't that they were just running away from their country. In fact, they went back to Nazareth eventually. So this idea that like he's a refugee and he's a poor man, like the only reason he was born in a stable wasn't because he was poor, it was because they didn't have room in the main building, and so he had to stay in one of the outbuildings. We are not talking about someone running. Now, eventually they would go down to Egypt for a while, but again, there were Jews in Egypt. Okay, we're not talking about like they were running away from one land to another. I mean, they did end up running away because Herod was trying to kill them. But it wasn't like they were going into coming from a barbaric land to another, more civilized land. You could move from place to place. Okay, there wasn't a whole lot of. I mean, Pax Romana is something you need to understand for that time period. And so there were Jews moving back and forth from Israel to Egypt and all of that. Alexandria would have had a lot of Jews in it. In fact, in the Bible, when it talks about the Grecians, a lot of times they were Greek-speaking Jews because the Greeks had conquered Egypt and Israel, and then Rome had come through and conquered a bunch of those. And so it was kind of all part of the same empire for a while. So again, it would be like me coming from New Hampshire to California. Yeah, different culture, some things I might not be used to. I'm going to have to get settled in, but we're not talking about someone coming from like Ethiopia and coming over to America. It's different. They're traveling around within the same empire. And then the final one, Christmas is about God identifying with the marginalized, not the powerful. Now again, you have to see all of the socialistic leftist mindsets hidden around behind these words. And I'm not trying to see a boogeyman behind every cliff. But I do want you guys to understand that there is a movement that demonizes the rich, that says that the immigrant's worth protecting. And I'm not saying they're not. Don't get me wrong. But again, if you're looking in the biblical context, which is the world of the Bible, which is the way the words were written, which is what they meant, These people are not comparable to someone coming from one country to another. But to say that it's God identifying with the marginalized, not the powerful, Jesus wasn't the marginalized. I mean, he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was someone who was not an attractive person. And so in some of those ways, as he grew up, he would be marginalized. But Jesus was wildly popular, and he didn't need the gifts from the wise men. They recognized his divinity, or if not his divinity, they recognized something special about him, and that's why they brought him gifts. And so this isn't a socialistic, we're going to side with this person over that person. And as you look at the introduction of Christmas, he's going to send a message to the shepherds in the form of angels. He's also going to send word through prophecy and things like that to the wise men, the magi, who are going to come from the east, and they came to worship him. And it apparently took a while to get there. We'll talk about that in another video. And so this idea of God is identifying with the marginalized, not the powerful. I just want you to understand, and this is how I responded to it, and you can see the comment there. None of this involved government programs. Okay, so we need to understand that. All this was individual. In fact, the only government program was Herod moving in to kind of kill him. So government wasn't really good in that case. But God identified with plenty of powerful people throughout the Bible. Abraham, Job, David, Solomon. The whole reason Solomon was known as Jedediah was because God loved him. Solomon was about as wealthy and powerful as you could possibly get, and he abused his power. But before all that, God loved him and gave him the name Jedediah. And so that was a name of Solomon. David was a man after God's own heart. Job, who was wildly wealthy, I mean, he was richer than anyone else in that area. God said he was a perfect man. And so what has happened is a lot of people keep coming at me with, the rich man entering, through the eye of the needle. And it's the rich man is compared to a camel coming through the eye of the needle. And I have to keep hitting back with, all that's saying is, if you are a greedy person, you're putting a snare in front of yourself. If you are a greedy person, you are setting up a trap that will probably end up damning you. I mean, that in the true biblical sense of the word, damning you. And so that's just something you've got to be cautious of. That's a warning that God is giving you. That it's not something to be taken lightly, because what he's doing is he's talking to the rich young ruler. If you're not familiar with the story, this rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so Jesus is like, well, what about the commandments? And he's like, oh, I've done all of them. Well, one of the commandments is, thou shalt not covet. And so Jesus decides to test how much he's actually dedicated to the 10 commandments. And so he says, all right, I want you to give away everything that you have. And the man goes, ooh. And he walks away sad because he has so much wealth that he's unwilling to part with it. And the idea is, when it comes to the idea of salvation, Jesus is going to demand something of us. He is going to say, there is something you are trusting in. There is something you are holding on to that is preventing you from putting your full trust in Christ. You need to let that go. And that's this idea of repentance. That's this idea of, there is a sin. There's something that you are holding on to that you need to let go. And Jesus says, let go, or there will be no salvation, because you're not truly trusting me, as long as you're holding on to that thing. And so he tested the rich man by saying, are you willing to give up everything? And the rich man goes, well, no, I'm not. And so he goes away sad. And so Jesus says, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. And what he literally meant was a camel through a literal eye of the needle. Like, how could you pass a camel through a needle? And the whole point was, because the disciples realized, that's not possible. And Jesus says, with man it is not possible, but with God all things are possible. So there's a level of trust we put in Christ to help this be possible. And so when people keep throwing this verse out, and you'll see what I mean, and it's happened more than once on this comment, I keep saying you have to look at the context. Because God identifies with all sorts of powerful people, but he identifies with all sorts of poor people too. So the point is not that you are godly because you're poor, because some of the most greedy people I know have been the poor people. And some of the most generous people I know, some of the most selfless people I know are rich people. So it has nothing to do with how rich or poor you are. You could be poor as dirt, and you could still be as greedy as that stereotypical bad man. And so I just want you guys to understand that. And so when we talk about Jesus, he used parables in order to help us understand some things. And so there's times where Jesus is going to use very extreme language, like a camel going through the eye of a needle. He's trying to make a point of how impossible it is to get saved on your own. How impossible it is for someone who is trusting in their riches to get to heaven. That's this idea, because it's a snare. There's another meme here, and you'll see it thrown up on the screen, like I said. And what they do is they're bashing what they call the Republican Jesus. And so again, you can see it. It starts out and it says, is it true I should give everything I have to the poor? And Jesus says that's ridiculous. If they don't want to be poor, they should get a job like everyone else. That's Jesus. Here's the big point I want to make. If you are studying the life of Christ, look at how many times he calls the government to do something and how many times he calls an individual to do it. Just do that study. Look at any time he tells a government to do anything like being generous. There are times where Jesus is going to call you to forgive those who have wronged you, but he's also going to tell the government to use the sword to execute a murderer. He's going to say, you need to be generous, but he'll talk about giving taxes to the government. There's all these things that you'll see. So what people are doing is they are missing the point. Jesus calls you to individual responsibility, individual action. So you are responsible to be generous. That's what I find funny. You do studies and you will look, because most conservatives, and I'll use that term as we use it in the States, most conservatives are far more generous in their giving charitably than what I will call the leftist, the liberal crowd. And it seems like a lot of the leftists, they give through taxes. They let themselves get the snot out of, and they do everything they can to get out of taxes, but they consider that their charitable giving somehow. Meanwhile, conservatives get taxed out the wazoo too, but they still give. And you can go look at the numbers. I'm not going to do the research for you. Go look at that. But I ask you, biblically speaking, if you study it out, and I'll tell you what the right answer is. Does God call the government to do the charitable work, or does God call individuals to do charitable work? He calls individuals. There's no place here for the government to come in, tax the snot out of you, and then give that money to random causes. That's not how it works. In fact, God through the Apostle Paul and others will have some very strong words for lazy people. In fact, he says, if you do not work, you should not eat. He will say, if you are someone who has the ability to work and you choose not to work, that you are considered unruly and you actually should get kicked out of the church for it. So he has some very strong opinions on people who would be collecting on the government dole. And so this idea, I'm not saying that everyone who's poor is in the wrong. I'm fairly poor myself. I've accrued some things because I don't spend my money on much other things other than giving it away. But I'm fairly poor, at least by American standards, but by the world standards, we in America are filthy rich. But this idea that the poor are inherently good because they're poor, or that the rich are inherently bad because they're rich, that's not a biblical case. But what Jesus is doing is he's saying, if you are greedy, you need to be careful because you're putting a snare in front of yourself. If you are someone who's absolutely lusting after money and you just have to have more and more and more, you are putting a snare in front of you. The Bible says if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. The Bible will say a lot of things to that effect. But it'll also say that if you see a widow who is a widow indeed, which means she doesn't have family to take care of her, then you are to take care of that woman. And so, again, Jesus is all for caring for the poor, but he's also for people working, and he's for both. So to caricature it like this, you can see that doesn't quite jive with the Bible. Now there's one more, and it's the WWJD thing. So some of you might remember that from the 90s. It was something that went around all way back in the day, and so you can see this is a fun one. You got Hipster Jesus and Trump Jesus, I don't know. And so WWJD, and on the one side it says, feed the hungry, care for the sick, shelter the homeless, love everyone. And then WWRJD, what would the Republican Jesus do? Cut food stamp benefits, gut affordable health care, demonize the homeless, block equality rights. I'll remind you, I'll have you go back to my previous point. Individual responsibility or government responsibility? When Jesus calls out and says you're to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God, is he talking to individuals or is he talking to the government? Because he has some very strong commands for kings, He tells kings not to be greedy, tells kings not to multiply military things, and that's to Israel. He tells people to love each other, and he has some very strong words for both groups. But when does Jesus ever tell the government to feed the hungry? He tells the church to take care of people. He tells the church to take care of the widows. Tells the church to what you do unto the least of. He tells everyone pretty much what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. So he definitely wants us to care for the sick, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless. Those are all good things. But where does he tell the government to do that? Because if you go over to the what would Republican Jesus do, the Republican platform used to be, and they're not so good anymore. But it used to be, let's get government out of things and let's put the responsibility back on individuals, which is the biblical thing. You have an individual mandate to do these things. But here's the thing, food stamp benefits, there are a lot of people who don't need to be on food stamps, but they are because their social worker told them if they get a more high-paying job, their social benefits are going to drop. So those people aren't actually needy. They've chosen to not work. They've chosen to work what they do to get more food stamp benefits. And I'm not saying if you get food stamp benefits, it's wrong. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying it should be the church's responsibility. Now, gut affordable health care. I'm telling you this. You study out what rates have done under Obamacare. That is not an affordable health care. Okay? So this idea of gutting affordable health care, what Trump did is remove the mandate that you had to do it through the government and that you paid a fine if you didn't have insurance. So basically all Obamacare did was say, oh, you don't have insurance? Well, we'll just give you a fine if you don't have it. So there was actually a time I didn't buy into the healthcare program right away, and I actually paid a fine because I didn't buy in right away. So that really helps someone who can't afford healthcare. I'm going to fine you until you finally go along with it. It's not as simple as gut affordable healthcare, okay? Because it's not affordable. It's still not affordable, okay? Demonize the homeless. Demonize or not, I just recently watched the video by Ben Shapiro on why he's moving out of California. And the LA homeless crisis is not just homelessness. It's needles and drugs and all sorts of vileness going on the streets. And so if you're shooting up in a park, your problem is not that you're homeless. Your problem is that you are addicted and you need to get help. And they're not concerned about getting help. I'm not saying every homeless person is that way. I know some respectable homeless people. Okay? There's one that lives near my church who kind of helps act as security. There's no shame in being homeless. But if you are hopped up on drugs and you are robbing each other and pillaging and doing all the stuff that happens, then that should be stopped. There's a homeless person who keeps terrorizing a church I know of. The church had to get a restraining order because the homeless person was going around turning all the water faucets on that the church left so that the homeless would have somewhere to bathe. And he was trying to just mess with the church and get it in trouble because if you leave the water faucets running, it actually gets the church in trouble. And so the church removed all the water spigots on the outside of their fence, so he jumped the fence and turned the water spigots on the inside of the church area. And so the pastor had to remove those water spigots. And then when the pastor set up the COVID signs so they could reopen, he went around ripping all the COVID signs down. So we don't demonize someone because they're homeless. We demonize them because they're doing bad things. And the homeless can do that and the not homeless can do that. So we don't just label someone as homeless good, homeless bad. That's not how we work. You have to look at the individual. But then this idea of blocking equality rights, it really depends on what you're talking about. Because, again, you look at the Bible, is there such a thing as equality? What does equality mean? Does equality mean equal opportunity or equal outcome? Because, again, I may try to run a YouTube channel, and I'm not going to succeed as well as someone like Ben Shapiro or Louder with Crowder or some of those other groups. I'm not as charismatic. I don't have the audience. I don't have the money, which they all kind of built it up from the ground anyway. But this idea of equality, I don't get equality of outcome. I can have equal access. You know, if they decided, oh, we're going to delete your channel because you're too good looking or whatever, that would be wrong. It'd be a lie, but it'd be wrong. And so this idea of equality rights, what are you talking about? Because in our country right now, whatever color you are, you have equal rights. That's what you do, but you might not have equal outcome. And that has a lot of reasons for why that's the case. But again, if you're saying that like I have the right to change my pronouns or I have the right to hormone blockers or things like that, I don't think you should have equal rights. And Jesus says, I made you male and female. So this idea that you just have equal rights, what does that mean? And so that's why these memes are dangerous. That's why they're stupid. That's why they don't accurately represent Christ. If you read the Old Testament, you are going to get a picture of how Christ thinks on things. You're going to see that he judges sin. You're going to see that he's not pro-homosexual. You're going to see that he's anti-divorce. In fact, he says things like, why was divorce allowed? Oh, it was for the hardness of your hearts. And so he'll bring that up. And so Jesus was not like this hipster, love everyone type guy. He cared for everyone, and he tried to see them, come to the delivery that he offered. But Jesus, he wasn't a hippie. In fact, Jesus made a whip and beat people to get them out of the temple because they were greedily charging exorbitant amounts for people who were going in to offer sacrifice. And so that's why I just be careful. Don't buy into this garbage that really is rooted in kind of a socialistic mindset. And so that's just kind of the episode for this week. Like I said, you're going to see a lot of other things coming down the pipe. We've got an episode on Christmas. We've got an episode on suffering. We've got a few other things that we're going to talk about the doctrines of some of these. But I wanted to get a picture of who Christ is and how he relates to modern day things. And I'm going to leave you with this. Before I get to the final point, I hope you guys have enjoyed the Janus Project. I'm going to ask you to please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone else. It helps me a lot to know that someone's watching this and that they're interacting with my material. And so I'd ask you that really quick. Just take a moment, like it, subscribe, share it with someone else. But as we close out, I just want you guys to understand, I am probably going to get into a few topics coming up that are what some people consider political. And I just want you to understand that not everything is political. So when I talk about abortion, it's not a political issue. It's a moral issue that people play politics with. And so I don't want to talk about political issues like, oh, should healthcare be universal or not? That's not so much a moral issue. That's pretty straightforward a political issue. But when I'm talking about like gay rights and transgender things, and when I'm talking about abortion, those aren't political issues. They are moral issues. They are life and death issues in some cases that have been politicized. People are using them as a political tool to get votes. And so I'll talk about those issues. I'm not going to shy away from them. I'm going to try to stay away from just pure politics. But we need to understand that a lot of the things that people are like, I don't like you talking politics. No, it's morality that's been politicized. And so I just want to leave you with that. And again, we'll talk about Jesus a little bit more. You'll get to know Jesus a little bit more through some of the things he said, some of the things he did. But I want you to understand, Jesus is not like a hipster, wussy man. He was about as manly of a man as you could possibly imagine. And I want to show that as we continue through this systematic theology for non-Christians. So if you want to know a little bit more about who Jesus is, just tune in. And so this is the Doctrine of Christ, and this is the Janus Project, and I will see you guys later.